My work on art and motherhood, I essentially about 7 years ago, I was quite interested in all the things that I thought were really taboo in the art world and why there were certain subjects the art world was a bit weird around. And those included childhood and parenthood and aging and that kind of thing. And I kind of pitched that idea on radio, and that never happened. Um, but about 5 years ago, 5 years ago, I was doing a lot of reports on all of these fantastic studies that were happening about gender balance in the art world. And I'm sure we've all read lots of those, but in the States, there were Charlotte Burns and Julia Halperin doing fantastic reports in coordination with ArtNet. And they did reports looking at gender balance, but also kind of race and representation. In the UK, for about 7 years, there have been the Freelands Foundation reports looking at the representation of female artists in Britain. In Australia, there have been the Countess reports, and there have been kind of parallel studies done in different parts of the world. And I've been reporting on the Freeland Foundation reports for quite a long time and studying the data. And one of the things I was really interested in was this kind of disparity between the number of female and non-binary art students, and particularly postgraduate art students that there were, and the number of female and non-binary artists that were represented by galleries. So if you look at the postgraduate students, it's about 63% female and non-binary. So that would be people doing MAs and PhDs. And quite often that's not people in their early 20s. That would be people taking a break and then coming back. So they'd be, like let's say in their late 20s. And then the proportions for the artists represented by galleries perfectly flips it. So it's about 63% of the artists represented by commercial galleries are male and the rest are female or non-binary. And it's really perplexing that should be the case. And I was really interested as to what was happening between these two sets of statistics. So you're there in your 20s studying for your MA or your PhD, and then if you're lucky as an artist, the time when you get representation tends to be when you're in your 30s approximately. And so I was kind of think about what else might be happening to people in their 30s. And of course, one thing that happens to a lot of people in their 30s is they start a family. And so I was really curious as to what we weren't seeing in these statistics. So I started to talk to Dr. Kate McMillan, who at that point was editing the Freelands Foundation reports. And she invited me to write an essay for the 2019 report looking at the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. And in a more normal world, that would have just been a really simple essay where I would have, let's say, interviewed about 5 people about their experience. But as it happened, I started researching the essay, and then the pandemic hit, and I suddenly had an awful lot of time on my hands and nowhere to go, as did a lot of other people. And I put a call out on Instagram saying, does anybody want to talk to me about the impact of motherhood on their career as an artist? And I just got this tidal wave of responses back. And because I suddenly didn't, I was like, well, okay, I'm going to honor this. I'm not going to gatekeep on this. Anybody that wants to be part of this study, I'm going to talk to. So I ended up interviewing just over 50 artists, and they were all based in the UK, but they had roots around the world. So we literally had artists with roots all the way from Guatemala to China. And they were all different stages of parenthood. So we had artists who were just in their first pregnancy, right up to grandmothers. And I think it was doing that where I suddenly realized that none of these people realized that the other people were going through the same things that they'd gone through. And it was only in talking to that many of them that I started to see patterns emerging. And of course, realizing that I'd gone through exactly the same thing myself, that all of these very essential components in the art world, which might seem like just nice, fluffy stuff when you look at them from the outside, but actually are really important bits of the way that we do business in the art world, like going to private views, are just not accessible to you if you're a caregiver, because they are between the hours of 6 and 8, which is, if you have children, exactly when you are making dinner, giving them a bath, reading them a book and putting them to bed. You just absolutely can't be there between 6 and 8 if you're the primary caregiver. And that also there is a kind of unspeakable aspect to having children that I could never say, okay, I need to leave now to pick my kids up from work, or I can't talk then because I'm with my children. It's like, oh, I've got a meeting.
Mm.
Um, so so that study ended up being an essay in the Freedoms Foundation report for 2019. And the picture that really came out was really, really bad. I mean, people had a really shocking time and generally felt extremely excluded from the art world. They felt belittled. They didn't feel like they were taken seriously. They felt that, artist mothers were seen as a joke. And also, there was no, I mean, well, I'll come on to this because this is something that I want to talk about in the future. But there's no route back into the art world once you've left it. Put a pin in that because I do want to come back, and please remind me to talk about that. So obviously when you see a bad situation, as I've said before, I'm a real kind of like interfering person. And when you see something like this happening and things going wrong, immediately it's like, well, what can I do to make this to sort this out? Um, so the first thing that I did was get together with a group of 30 artist mothers. And again, these are all people who volunteered, and we collaborated on a manifesto called How Not to Exclude Artist Parents, a guide for, I think it's a guide for institutions and residencies. And that was really a set of 10 points about how to be more inclusive. And they've been since translated into 16 different languages, including Arabic and Japanese. And generally, they've been translated by groups of artists. So it's been very nice because it's actually brought people together in groups to talk about this issue in their own countries, in their own communities. Um, and they've been shared very widely. And what I'd hoped would happen, I think very much has happened, which is that people also use the points in the manifesto essentially as tools to advocate for themselves. So they've included them in grant applications, they've used them to defend the choices they've made, or to argue the fact that, yeah, okay, maybe there's a 10-year blank on my CV, but that was when I was a caregiver and I shouldn't be judged negatively for that. So people are really using them, and they're open source, so anybody can reprint them, anybody can publish them, you can do whatever you like with them, apart from possibly bad things. But I mean, you can use them in any way that works or is useful for you. And the next thing that I did was write a book called How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents, which came out in Europe in September 2022 and in the States in February 2023. And that's really, it breaks down all the different stages of an artist's career and looks at how motherhood is excluded or makes life difficult at various stages, whether that's being an art student. I mean, did you know at your art school? I mean, obviously your art school's online, so anybody can breastfeed anytime they want.
Yeah.
But theoretically, any art school should have a lactation suite so that people can go and express milk. I don't think there are actually any art schools in the UK that have a lactation suite, but that should be provided. Um, and for example, art students were constantly being informed that motherhood was not an appropriate subject for them to make art about. And were also being fed this line that if they became a mother, they would not be taken seriously as an artist. And it's amazing because I remember this being discussed by my contemporaries back in the early 90s, and my contemporaries at art school saying I'm not going to have children because nobody will take me seriously. The fact that message is still being reinforced is really bad.
And is
And
that something you gleaned from the interviews, from the
yeah,
research?
yes, I mean the last decade, yeah.
Yeah.
And very little provision was made, for example, for students who became pregnant during their time at art school. They weren't allowed to defer easily. I mean, particularly if you're doing a course where you're dealing with quite toxic materials, as a lot of us do in the art world. If you're doing ceramics or something, you should be allowed to defer for a year if you're pregnant. There's no question about that. It shouldn't be like a fight with the art school to say, you know what, I'm pregnant and it's really actually not safe for me to be in this situation. Um, but people were really being put into very bad, being forced to kind of stick with things, particularly if it's a really prestigious postgraduate course. And yeah, and let's say you've traveled from outside of the UK to be on a prestigious postgraduate course in the UK. What are you going to do if you're getting a lot of pushback, and they're saying, well, no, you can't defer.
have you been able to challenge art schools about this?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a really fantastic initiative that was done at the Royal College of Art called Second Shift, which I mean, I don't want to flatter myself, but I think was somewhat stimulated by the discussions that were kind of coming up around this. And Isis and Lulu started this thing called Second Shift at the Royal College of Art and had a really good, I don't want to say seminar, let's say ovular, about motherhood in the context of the art world and the academy. And I think they're definitely starting conversations about that. One thing, I think commercial galleries are really squeamish about all of this. It's been really interesting. So another thing that's come out of the work that I've been doing was that at the point where I launched How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents, I was getting a lot of communication from other art world professionals going, well, yeah, it's all very well talking about artists, but I'm an academic and it's absolutely appalling being an academic. And I basically have been essentially stuck in a really dead-end job because they won't advance me through the art school because I've got caregiving responsibilities. And then you hear all these horror stories about people who work in comms having miscarriages when they're at art fairs and being told they can't leave their post at the reception desk, or I mean, just like general horror stories. And so at the time that How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents came out, Joe Harrison, who has the Repronomics Research Project that looks at the intersection of reproduction and economics, and is also a gallerist as well as a researcher, we launched something called the Art Working Parents Alliance, which is a network and a support organization and a campaigning group for all parents in the art world. In fact, we started it as being all parents apart from artists because we thought the artists could go off and form their own group, but they want to be part of our group now. So it's everybody now. And you know, parents, not just mothers, you know, mothers, fathers, and those who don't identify by other description are very welcome. And we have WhatsApp groups that are divided by region. So you can be in a WhatsApp group where you've got probably the chance of meeting people that are kind of in your area that have children and are in a similar field. And there are also WhatsApp groups by sector. So there's a WhatsApp group for academics, there's one for people working in commercial galleries, there's one for I can't remember the other groups, but we've got lots of, and people in the public sector and curatorial. So Xavier, I've completely forgotten the question.
No, you're very.
Well, no, you were telling us about how
you
you set up the alliance. The question was about how to affect change, really, by infiltrating and challenging gallerists.
So one of the things that's come out of the Art Working Parents Alliance is that Cleo Roberts and Kate McMillan did a study looking at the maternity or paternity provision in commercial galleries and how they dealt with having pregnant staff in commercial galleries. And they've done this study, and apparently it's absolutely hair-raising. And we can't find anywhere that will host the launch of the report.
Oh, goodness.
So there's clearly all of the galleries a bit like, yeah, we're not going to come off well from this. So, and it's terrible because also every time I meet a gallerist and hear good things about them, I'm like, oh yeah, XYZ gallery, they've got loads of women on their roster, they've got loads of mothers on their roster. They're like, yeah, well, they're fine with their artists, but they're terrible with their staff. So I mean, it's really interesting. There's still a lot to be done. It's this ongoing weird thing about the art world where we always think that we're really progressive, but in lots of ways we're incredibly conservative. And part of that is because we're not very regulated and there's not an HR department in the art world. So we can't go to the HR department and go, you know what, I agreed to 3 weeks maternity leave and that is just insanity. And I need longer.